It started the way trouble always does, with men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. A quiet town, a simple farmer's son, a group of outlaw bikers who had grown too comfortable, too sure of their control. They had no idea the man they were about to intimidate wasn't just another local. He was a retired Navy SEAL. A man who had spent years in the fire of war, trained not just to survive but to eliminate threats with precision. Jason Walker had come home to Oakridge, Montana, expecting peace. After 15 years of service, after deserts and jungles and battlefields far from home, he thought he'd finally found a place where the only fight left was against the changing seasons. A place where he could mend fences, fix tractors, and breathe in the clean country air without looking over his shoulder. But trouble had other plans. A notorious biker gang, the Iron Vultures, had settled into town like a sickness, spreading fear wherever they went. Store owners paid them for protection, not out of choice, but because those who refused found their windows smashed, their livelihoods burned to the ground. Folks kept their heads down, hoping if they stayed quiet, the storm would pass. Jason's father, George Walker, never believed in keeping quiet. And when he refused to pay, the threats started. The Iron Vultures thought Jason was just another easy target. They were wrong. What happened next would be talked about for years. A fight. For justice, a test of patience, and a lesson in what happens when the wrong men pick the wrong fight. So stick around, because this story isn't just about a man standing his ground. It's about what it truly means to fight for what's right. And before we begin, let me ask you this. If it were your town, your family, your home, what would you do? Stand and fight or turn away? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in standing strong, hit that like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a tale of courage like this one. Jason Walker stood by the old wooden fence, his fingers absently running across the rough grain of the wood. The Montana wind carried the scent of dry earth and fresh-cut hay, stirring the golden waves of wheat that stretched endlessly before him. The sight should have brought him peace. After all, this was home, the place where he'd spent his boyhood, chasing sunsets and riding horses through open fields. But after 15 years away, something about it felt different. It wasn't just the land that had changed. Oakridge, Montana, had always been a town where folks waved as they passed, where neighbors showed up unannounced with pies and handshakes, a place where the biggest concern was the winter storms or the occasional coyote sighting. But now, something else hung in the air, something Jason recognized all too well. Fear. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Doors locked earlier. Conversations hushed as people glanced over their shoulders. The laughter that once filled the town square was gone, replaced by whispers and lowered voices. Even the old general store, once a hub of gossip and greetings, felt quiet, its windows smeared with dust and the open sign hanging crookedly on its nail. Jason hadn't been back long, but he didn't need much time to put the pieces together. The Iron Vultures. The name alone was enough to set jaws tightening. A gang of outlaw bikers that had slithered into town over the past year, turning Oakridge into their personal playground. They didn't just ride through and move on. They stayed, settled in like a sickness that wouldn't pass. They collected protection money from shop owners, threatened families, and left broken glass and bruised ribs as warnings. Those who resisted faced worse. And Jason's father, George Walker, had resisted. Jason ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the tension settle in. His father was as stubborn as they came, an old cowboy who believed in hard work, honesty, and never bending to bullies. It was that same unshakable belief that had led him to refuse the Iron Vulture's demands. And that's when the threats started. First, it was slashed tires on the farm truck. Then a brick through the kitchen window in the dead of night. A few days later, someone had shut out the floodlight by the barn. Small things. But Jason knew how this kind of game was played. It always started small. Then it escalated. Jason exhaled slowly, glancing toward the house. His father was inside, probably pretending like nothing was wrong, refusing to acknowledge the storm brewing on their doorstep. But Jason had spent too many years in combat zones not to recognize the signs. This wasn't just petty crime. This was control. And men like the Iron Vultures didn't stop until someone made them. Jason's grip tightened on the fence post. He had come home looking for peace, but trouble had found him first. He'd seen fear like this before, in villages, halfway across the world, where warlords ruled with an iron fist, where people whispered in shadows, hoping not to be noticed. Oakridge wasn't some war-torn country, but if these bikers thought they could turn it into one, they were about to learn a lesson the hard way. Jason had spent his entire life fighting battles that weren't his own, but this was personal. The Rusty Spoon Diner had been a cornerstone of Oakridge for as long as Jason could remember. Its checkered floor tiles were worn from decades of boots shuffling in and out, the scent of bacon and coffee forever lingering in the air. A place of comfort, of familiarity. But that morning it felt different. Jason sat in the farthest booth, his back to the wall, an old habit he hadn't quite shaken. The ceramic mug in his hands was warm, the black coffee, inside rich and smooth. He wasn't thinking about war. He wasn't thinking about bikers. For the first time in a long while, he was simply still. Then came the sound, a low, rolling thunder of engines in the distance, growing louder with each second. Jason didn't flinch, didn't even glance toward the window, but he felt it. That shift in the air, the way conversation around him slowed, then stopped entirely. The Iron Vultures had arrived. The door swung open with an unnecessary force, the bell above it ringing sharply. 3 men stepped inside, boots heavy against the tile. Vince Moretti led the way, his presence filling the small space. His leather vest, adorned with patches, stretched over his broad frame. A pair of aviator sunglasses sat perched on his nose, but Jason knew exactly what lay behind them. Cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing. Behind him, Dale "Snake" Carter followed, his wiry frame taut with tension, a smirk playing at his lips. His fingers drummed idly against his belt, where Jason was certain a blade was hidden. Then there was Mickey Ghost Lorne, broad-shouldered and silent, his gaze flicking around the diner like he was already measuring who would run and who might stand their ground. Vince spotted Jason immediately, a slow grin stretching across his face as he made his way over. He slid into the booth across from Jason like he owned the place, stretching his arms across the backrest. Snake took a seat next to him, while Ghost remained standing, blocking the path to the door. Jason barely looked up from his coffee. "Look who we got here," Vince drawled, removing his sunglasses and tossing them onto the table. "The big bad Navy boy back to play cowboy." Jason took a sip of his coffee, unbothered. "Just having breakfast, Vince. You should try it sometime." Ghost let out a low chuckle, but Snake wasn't amused. His fingers kept tapping against the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a snake waiting to strike. "We hear you and your old man think you're too good for our arrangement," Vince continued, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "That's a problem." Jason finally met Vince's gaze, his blue eyes unreadable. "Sounds like your problem." The air in the diner thickened. The handful of customers who had been enjoying their morning meals now sat frozen, eyes darting toward the confrontation, but no one dared to speak. Even the waitress behind the counter, who had been refilling a cup of coffee, hesitated, gripping the handle of the pot a little tighter. Vince leaned in closer, his smile never reaching his eyes. "You got 2 choices, Walker. Either you and your old man play ball, or we make life difficult." Jason tilted his head slightly, a slow, amused smirk playing at his lips. "You think you're the first tough guy I've dealt with?" Snake's tapping fingers stopped. Ghost shifted slightly, cracking his knuckles. Vince's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. "See, Jason, the thing about small towns like this is everybody's got something to lose. You've been gone too long to care about much, but your old man, the farm, that little diner down the street." He gestured lazily toward the window. "People depend on that land, that store, that peace. And right now, I own all of it." Jason didn't blink. "You don't own a damn thing," he said evenly. Vince chuckled, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong." He exhaled as if he actually felt bad for the position Jason was in. "You think these folks are going to back you up? You think they want to fight? You served your country, sure, but you left this town a long time ago. Me? I'm here every day. These people, they know me." Jason's grip tightened slightly around his coffee mug. He didn't look away. He let the silence stretch. Vince watched him, waiting for some kind of reaction, some hint of uncertainty. But Jason had been trained for this. Not in diners, not against bikers, but in situations where hesitation meant death. He didn't fidget. He didn't blink. The tension hung thick between them, stretching out like a wire pulled too tight. Snake finally broke the silence. "I think we ought to remind him who runs this town," he muttered, shifting in his seat. Ghost took a step closer. Vince held up a hand, stopping them. He studied Jason for a moment longer, then let out a soft chuckle. "Not today," he said, standing. "But soon." Jason leaned back in his seat, watching as Vince slid his sunglasses back on. The biker leader adjusted his vest, flashing a smirk that was all teeth. "You're gonna learn, Walker," he said, "one way or another." With that, Vince turned and strode toward the door, his men following. The diner remained silent as the bell jingled above the exit. The roar of engines filled the air. Again, then faded into the distance. Only after a full minute passed did the tension begin to ease. People shifted in their seats, utensils clinking against plates once more. The waitress, still holding the coffee pot, let out a slow breath. Jason finished the last sip of his coffee, then set the cup down gently. He had no doubt that Vince would be back. And next time, he wouldn't just be talking. The Montana evening stretched long, the sky a deep shade of indigo as the last traces of sunlight dipped behind the rolling hills. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and hay, the comforting reminders of home. Jason stood by the fence, hands resting on the rough wood, staring out at the land his father had worked for decades. It should have felt peaceful, but instead, unease settled in his gut like a weight. Behind him, George Walker emerged from the barn, a tired sigh escaping his lips. "Truck tires are slashed," he muttered, running a weathered hand over his graying beard. "Bastards don't even try to hide it." Jason turned, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the damage. The wooden barn doors bore deep gouges, as if a knife or a set of keys had been dragged across them. A few feet away, the Keep Out sign lay in the dirt, stomped into the mud. Jason knelt down, brushing his fingers over the mangled sign, jaw tightening. This wasn't just a warning, it was a message. "They want us scared," George continued, his voice steady but low. "They think if they push hard enough, we'll fold like the others." Jason straightened, exhaling through his nose. "They're testing us," his father nodded, "and they'll keep pushing until somebody pushes back." Jason met his father's gaze. "Then I'll handle it." A long pause stretched between them. George had always been a man of few words, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't just worried about the farm, he was worried about his son. "I know you can, boy," George finally said. But the town's scared. They think standing up will only make things worse. Jason glanced toward the road. A few neighbors stood at a distance, murmuring among themselves. He recognized the looks on their faces, the same ones he'd seen in occupied villages overseas. Fear, uncertainty, helplessness. He set his jaw. That night, Jason didn't sleep. He sat on the front porch, Remington 870 resting across his lap, eyes fixed on the long dirt road leading up to the house. The hours dragged on, the only sounds coming from the rustling trees and the distant calls of coyotes. Then, just after midnight, the low growl of engines broke the silence. Jason's grip tightened on the shotgun as headlights cut through the darkness. 3 motorcycles slowed to a stop at the edge of the driveway, their chrome reflecting the pale moonlight. Vince Moretti was the first to dismount. His smirk was visible even in the dim light. "Nice night for a visit, ain't it?" Jason didn't move. "You're trespassing." Vince chuckled, nodding to his men. Snake and Ghost stepped off their bikes, their boots crunching against the gravel. Ghost casually cracked his knuckles. "Relax," Vince said. "Just checking in, making sure. Everything's running smooth around here." Jason's expression didn't change. "That's funny, because it looks a lot like intimidation." Vince tisked, shaking his head. "Nah, just a friendly warning. You know how it is. Things break, accidents happen. Be a real shame if this farm of yours went up in flames." Jason's fingers flexed around the shotgun. "That a threat?" Vince exhaled, acting as if the whole thing was just a misunderstanding. "Call it business." Jason let the silence settle. Let Vince believe for just a moment that the threat had landed. Then he stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. He stepped off the porch, closing the distance between them. Vince had seen plenty of men try to stare him down before. Business owners, bar managers, ranchers who thought they had a little fight in them, until they didn't. But Jason Walker wasn't one of those men. Vince saw it now, the way Jason moved, the way his shoulders squared, the way his eyes stayed locked, steady. It was the look of someone who had spent years surviving worse things than a few thugs on motorcycles. Jason stopped just feet away from him, his voice low, calm. "This ain't your turf, Moretti. You want a war, you just found one." For the first time something flickered behind Vince's eyes. Snake growled, stepping up. "You think you're a tough guy?" Jason didn't hesitate. His right fist snapped forward, fast and brutal, catching Snake in the ribs. A sharp exhale escaped the biker as he staggered back, clutching his side. Ghost moved next, but Jason shifted, stepping into him before he could react. A quick elbow strike to the gut sent the bigger man stumbling. Vince didn't move, but his smirk was gone. Jason's breathing remained steady, his stance unshaken. His hands were loose, relaxed, ready for more. Vince watched him carefully, then raised a hand, signaling his men to stop. Snake was still hunched over, wheezing, while Ghost took a cautious step back. "Whoa now," Vince said smoothly, forcing a chuckle. "No need for that." His tone had lost some of its edge. He adjusted his vest, putting on a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll regret this, Walker." Jason didn't respond. He just stared. And Vince knew. He knew the way. A man looked when he wasn't bluffing. After a long moment, Vince nodded once to his men. They backed off, Snake shooting Jason a glare as he wiped blood from his lip. Ghost, however, seemed less sure than before. Vince climbed back onto his bike, flicking his sunglasses down over his nose. "This ain't over," he said over the roar of the engine. Jason didn't move as the 3 bikers turned and sped off, their taillights disappearing down the road. Only when the night was silent again did he finally exhale, rolling the tension out of his shoulders. Behind him, the porch light flicked on. George stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Jason turned back toward the empty road, his grip tightening on the shotgun once more. He had no doubt they'd be back. And next time they wouldn't just be talking. The Rusty Spoon Diner had been a cornerstone of Oakridge for as long as Jason could remember. Its checkered floor tiles were worn from decades of boots shuffling in and out, the scent of bacon and coffee forever lingering in the air. A place of comfort, of familiarity. But that morning, it felt different. Jason sat in the farthest booth, his back to the wall, an old habit that had never faded. His hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, the warmth seeping into his fingers. The coffee was strong, black, just how he liked it. He took a slow sip, savoring the quiet. No gunfire. No sandstorms. Just the low murmur of conversation, the scrape of forks against plates, the hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Then came the sound, a low, rolling thunder of engines in the distance, growing louder. Deliberate, intentional. Jason didn't flinch, didn't even glance toward the window. But he felt it, that shift in the air, the way conversation around him slowed, then stopped entirely. The Iron Vultures had arrived. The diner's door swung open with unnecessary force, the bell above it ringing sharp against the sudden hush. The heavy thud of boots followed. 3 men stepped inside, their presence pulling the oxygen from the room. Vince Moretti led the way. He walked like he owned the place, his broad frame stretching the leather vest that bore the gang's insignia. Aviator sunglasses perched on his nose, but Jason knew exactly what lay behind them. Cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing. Behind him, Dale, Snake Carter, moved with twitchy energy, his wiry frame taut as a coiled spring. His fingers drummed idly against his belt, right where Jason was certain a blade rested. Then there was Mickey Ghost Lorne, broad-shouldered and silent, his gaze flicking around the diner, measuring. He was looking for weakness. Who might run? Who might try to be a hero? Jason wasn't interested in either. Vince spotted him immediately. Of course he did. The slow grin stretched across his face as he made his way over, boots heavy against the tile, unhurried, dominant. He slid into the booth across from Jason like he was an old friend dropping in for a chat. Snake took the seat beside him, smirking. Ghost didn't sit. He stayed by the door, effectively blocking the only exit. Jason barely looked up from his coffee. "Look who we got here," Vince drawled, removing his sunglasses and tossing them onto the table. The big bad Navy boy back to play cowboy. Jason took another sip. Unbothered. "Just having breakfast, Vince. You should try it sometime." Ghost let out a low chuckle, but Snake wasn't amused. His fingers kept tapping against the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Vince leaned in slightly, resting an arm over the back of the booth. "We hear you and your old man think you're too good for our arrangement," he said, voice thick with mock politeness. "That's a problem." Jason finally met his gaze, his blue eyes calm, unreadable. "Sounds like your problem." The diner held its breath. The customers who had been eating moments ago were now frozen, eyes darting between their plates and the confrontation. The waitress behind the counter had stopped mid-pour, her hand gripping the handle of the coffee, but a little tighter. Vince's smirk deepened, but it never reached his eyes. "You got 2 choices, Walker. Either you and your old man play ball, or we make life difficult." Jason tilted his head slightly, a faint amused smirk playing at his lips. "You think you're the first tough guy I've dealt with?" Snake's tapping fingers stopped. Ghost shifted, cracking his knuckles. Vince's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. "See, Jason, the thing about small towns like this is everybody's got something to lose. You've been gone too long to care about much. But your old man, the farm, that little diner down the street?" He gestured lazily toward the window. "People depend on that land, that store, that piece, and right now, I own all of it." Jason didn't blink. "You don't own a damn thing. he said evenly. Vince exhaled, like he actually felt bad for Jason. You think these folks are gonna back you up? You think they want to fight? His voice was silk and poison. You served your country, sure, but you left this town a long time ago. Me? I'm here every day. These people, they know me. Jason's grip on the coffee mug didn't tighten, didn't shift. But Vince saw it now. The way Jason sat completely. Still, no wasted movements. The quiet, assessing eyes. No fear. This was not a man you could shake. Vince let the silence stretch, waiting, poking for a crack. But Jason had been trained for this. Not in diners, not against bikers, but in situations where hesitation meant death. Finally, Snake broke the silence. I think we ought to remind him who runs this town, he muttered, shifting in his seat. Ghost took a step closer. Vince held up a hand. He studied Jason for a moment longer, then let out a soft chuckle. Not today, he said, standing. But soon. Jason leaned back in his seat, watching as Vince slid his sunglasses back on. The biker leader adjusted his vest, flashing a smirk that was all teeth. You're gonna learn, Walker, one way or another. With that, Vince turned and strode toward the door, his men following. The diner remained silent as the bell jingled above the exit. The roar of engines filled the air again, then faded into the distance. Only after a full minute passed did the tension begin to ease. People shifted in their seats, utensils clinking against plates once more. The waitress, still holding the coffee pot, let out a slow breath. Jason finished the last sip of his coffee, set the cup down gently. He had no doubt that Vince would be back, and next time, he wouldn't just be talking. The next morning, Jason walked into the general store, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The air inside was thick, heavy with unspoken fear. Men and women gathered near the aisles, whispering among themselves, their eyes flicking toward him before looking away. He set his hands on the counter, his voice steady but firm. This ends today. Silence. No one moved. He scanned their faces, people he'd known his whole life. Jim Dawson, the mechanic, stood near the shelves of canned goods, arms crossed. Mary Ann Reed, who ran the post office, held her breath. Even old Frank Carter, who'd owned the town's hardware store since before Jason was born, looked uneasy. Jason let the quiet stretch. I know what you're thinking, he continued. You've been living under their thumb so long you don't believe you can fight back. You think standing up means getting hurt. His blue eyes hardened. But what's worse, getting hurt or losing everything? Because that's where this is heading. If we don't stop Vince Moretti now, we never will. A chair scraped against the floor. Jim Dawson pushed forward, his jaw set. I'm in. Jason met his gaze. Then slowly others followed. A hesitant hand from Mary Ann. A nod from Frank. One by one, fear gave way to resolve. By the time Jason walked out of that store, Oakridge had made its choice. Jason wasted no time. They didn't have the manpower to take Vince head-on, so he needed to be smart. He divided the group into positions, some at the farm, others spread across town. They reinforced doors, laid out roadblocks, made sure every vulnerable spot was covered. Frank and Jim took charge of arming those who were willing to fight. Rifles, shotguns, even old hunting bows. Anything they could use. As the sun dipped, behind the Montana hills, Jason stood at the edge of his father's property, staring down the road. He knew Vince would retaliate. He was counting on it. The first sign came in the form of distant thunder, engines, 15 of them. Jason stood in the middle of the road, waiting. The others were in position, hidden in alleys, behind fences, on rooftops, waiting. The roar of motorcycles grew louder until headlights cut through the darkness. The Iron Vultures rolled into town like a storm rolling over the plains. Vince was the first to dismount. His boots hit the ground hard as he removed his helmet, tossing it onto his bike. The others followed, spreading out like wolves marking their territory. He took a step forward, grinning. "Come out, Walker." Jason didn't move. "You boys lost?" Vince let out a cold chuckle, shaking his head. "You should have walked away." Jason's voice dropped, cold as steel. "I was about to say the same thing." And then the town struck. Floodlights blasted to life, blinding the bikers. Doors slammed open. Armed townsfolk emerged from alleys, and rooftops, barrels aimed steady. For a single breath, the night was silent. Then all hell broke loose. A biker reached for his gun. Bang! A shotgun blast ripped into the ground near his feet, sending him stumbling back. Another man bolted for his bike, but Jim tackled him before he got 2 steps. Jason moved fast, too fast. Snake lunged at him, a blade flashing in the dim light. Jason ducked, twisted, and drove a brutal fist into his ribs. The breath whooshed from the biker's lungs as he doubled over, just in time for Jason to send an elbow across his jaw. Snake dropped. Ghost swung at Jason, but Jason was already moving. A sharp jab, a knee to the gut, then a final hook to the temple. Ghost collapsed, motionless. Vince saw his crew falling apart. He cursed, scrambling for his bike, but Jason was faster. He grabbed Vince by the collar and yanked him down, sending both men crashing into the dirt. A brutal grapple. Fists, dust, knuckles splitting skin. Vince swung hard. Jason blocked, countered, and then Jason pinned him. Vince struggled, but Jason pressed a forearm against his throat. "It's over," Jason growled. Sirens, Sheriff Logan, Hunt and his deputies arrived just as the last of the bikers hit the ground. One by one, Vince's men were hauled up, cuffed, thrown into the backs of patrol cars. Vince lay there, panting beneath Jason's grip, his reign of terror crumbling. Around him, Jason leaned in close, voice calm. "You should have picked another town." Vince said nothing. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in his cold, defeated stare. Oakridge was free. A week later, the farm stood rebuilt. The town had come together. Planks nailed, fences repaired. The barn rising again like a symbol of what they'd won. Jason leaned against the wooden post, watching as Jim patted the last nail into place. George Walker walked up beside his son, arms crossed. "You did good, boy." Jason took a deep breath, scanning the town. No fear, no hesitation, just people standing tall. For the first time since coming home, he finally felt at peace.